Welcome everyone to Storylines for 2022. Where does climate journalism hit the wall? I'm Mitchell Beer, publisher of The Energy Mix, and we are delighted that you could join us. I'm going to start by acknowledging how grateful we are to manage and publish The Energy Mix from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in the city also known as Ottawa. We know that the Algonquin and Anishinaabe have lived on this territory for millennia, acknowledge how deeply we benefit from the way their culture and presence continue to nurture this land. And we strive every day to produce our publication in a way that supports true justice and meaningful reconciliation among peoples. The Energy Mix is a news website and e-digest on climate, energy, and the shift off carbon. This session is about the role of climate journalism, and you've all proven how much that role matters by being here today, after nearly 350 of you voted with your feet and signed up for this webinar. We're live streaming on Facebook as well. This session also reflects an approach to opinion leader journalism that we've been working on since late last year. It starts with digging out the news, following the evidence where it leads, telling the whole story. But in a climate emergency, it also recognizes the groups and audiences that can play a disproportionate role in driving faster, deeper carbon cuts if they have the information to make a difference. That's why 3 of our panelists today come from the worlds of community climate finance, clean electricity, and cities and communities. Our site will begin featuring specialized content for those groups in the next few days. We are also marking a moment of celebration. In 2013, a team of 4 retired journalists formed the Climate News Network in the United Kingdom. Last fall, we merged our publications. Our panelist today, Alex Kirby, is one of those outstanding professionals, and I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge their contribution to climate news and now to the Energy Mix. And that is all you're going to hear about us today, because this webinar is about the panelists and it's about all of you. I'll briefly introduce the speakers when you first meet them, and you can find their impressive detailed biographies on the event page. We'll go through a series of discussion questions, then we're hoping to open the floor for at least 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So please type your questions in the Q&A box while the session is running. You'll receive a link to the recording after the session. That's been the most frequently asked question so far. And you can live tweet using the #Storylines2022 hashtag. And now, let me introduce the journalists on today's panel. Anna Hyatt, executive editor covering Climate Now in New York City, and Alex Kirby, co-founder of Climate News Network in Brighton and Hove, UK. We hope and expect that Megan Darby, editor of Climate Home News in London, UK, will be joining us later. Our first question is, where does climate journalism hit the wall? And how has that question changed, even just in the few weeks since we crafted it together, with the shift in coverage brought on by Russia's war in Ukraine? Anna, would you like to start?
I'd love to. It's so nice to be here with you all. Thank you so much. This is actually a question we think about a lot at Covering Climate Now, because the mission of the organization is to improve the quantity and quality of climate coverage all around the world. We're a collaboration of more than 500 news outlets, and we're trying to organize journalists and newsrooms to commit to integrating climate into their daily coverage on an ongoing basis, even when there's not a news hook. So there might not be a flood, but we want to see climate coverage high up on the page, on the homepage, on the front page, on social. We need to see it constantly. And the invasion of Ukraine was a really interesting and important example. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, and 4 days later, the IPCC released the second part of the 6th assessment. And we knew that that this report was not going to get the coverage that the first did in August. And we were disappointed that that was the case, but we also knew that the priority of all journalists and all editors was, of course, going to be Russia and Ukraine, as well it should be. And it would not be as big of a problem that this report was not covered as August was, if journalism as a whole treated climate coverage not as it does every other story, where a news hook is required, where the release of a report is the news hook. It would be less of a problem if climate coverage were integrated into everyday coverage. And this is something that we really ask editors to do. We've started asking more, is to pose at the beginning of the day, what is your climate coverage for today? What is your climate story today? Let's ensure that this is a part of the daily rhythm of a newsroom. In the same way as an editor might ask, what's the DC story today? So when the invasion happened, we knew that this sort of growing surge of climate coverage that we really saw picking up in the middle of last year was going to lessen for a little while. And I want to highlight something that I think really exemplifies this. The managing director of Al Jazeera, and then I'll kick it to you, Alex. I feel very passionately about this, and I think that you'll this will probably resonate with you. The managing director of Al Jazeera, Giles Trendle, we did a Q&A with him, Covering Climate Now did a few weeks ago, and it's a phrase he uses often. He talks about the tyranny of the immediate, that climate coverage falls victim within the newsroom to the tyranny of the immediate, which basically means that, he says, breaking news tends to muscle out other scheduled programming. So whatever the big news story is of the day, and this is classic across every beat, every interested party, every really passionate editor in the newsroom wants their story to be in the lead spot. The breaking news of the day is going to muscle that out. So I just wanted to share that term at the top too. The tyranny of the immediate. The immediate is something that we really think about, and that Russia's invasion of Ukraine exemplified.
Thanks, Anna. Just before we go to you, Alex, the tyranny of the immediate, I find, even hits within the broad range of climate news. There are so many stories we're following that we want to follow more closely, that we want to report on it all. And yet, for better and for worse, there is so much breaking news in this space that it's impossible to get them in. We only have 36 spots a week. Alex, you just need to unmute.
I had. Sorry, I'm
There you
sorry.
are.
Am I unmuted? Right. Thank you very much. Technology is beyond me. Where does climate journalism hit the wall? Well, it seems to me it's only fairly recently that we've stopped hitting the wall, because when we started the Climate News Network 8.5 years ago, it was still in the days when, for one reason or another, I'm not pointing fingers here, I'm just stating facts, there were a number of people in prominent positions who made a point of saying that climate change was not happening, or if it was happening, it was entirely natural, or that even if it wasn't natural, it wasn't anything to do with human activity. So it was a relief to us when, a few years after we'd begun, we found that that was slackening off, and more people were thinking that climate change was perhaps our responsibility and was serious and did need something doing about it. So the wall has gone away, and we rejoiced in that for a long time, because we thought that people would now take seriously what we had been trying to tell them. Of course, in the last month, things have changed radically with the events in, we're not allowed to call them anything more than events, in Ukraine. What I think that means for us as journalists covering climate is two things, really. First, that we need to listen to the immediate warning from Ukraine, because it points to what could happen, to what climate disaster could soon mean. What is happening there? The leveling of cities, the mass, it's mass destruction in a way, and the mass deaths that are occurring, that could be happening on a larger scale with what is possibly going to happen with climate change. So it's obvious, I think, that anyone threatened with an immediate problem like that is going to pay attention to that and focus there. At the same time, I think we need to stay focused. I'm certain we need to stay focused on the climate threat, because before long, that could be far, far worse than Ukraine is likely to be. So it's a dual lesson that I take from Ukraine. It's a warning that we need to heed right now, but it is a warning of how much worse things could be. That is the wall that climate journalism and all journalism really has hit just now. I spent large parts of my career as a journalist not being used, not being in demand, because my speciality, the environment, was not something that was hitting the headlines. I imagine many journalists are experiencing the same right now. But if we look for the humanity, the human side of what is happening in Ukraine, that gives pretty well all of us an important story to tell. And that is where I think the wall falls down.
Thanks very much to you both. Our next question is for our climate practitioners. Greg Overmont, Director of Marketing and Communications with the Van City Community Investment Bank in Toronto. Binu Jayakumar, Director of Clean Energy at the Pembina Institute in Calgary. And Steve Winkleman, Executive Director of the Climate Action, of the Ottawa Climate Action Fund. Greg, where have you seen the biggest successes and the biggest gaps in climate news reporting?
Thanks, Mitchell. Yeah, so for some context where I'm coming from, so I lead marketing here at Van City Community Investment Bank. We invest in clean energy projects across the country, and previously was the marketing at CoPower, an investment firm that invests in clean energy. And so from my perspective, my job is to work with the team who are doing really cool stuff and share that widely. And however I can share that widely, and working with journalism is a big part of that. And so I think from my seat, some of the biggest success that I've seen over the last decade is the increasing use of data and strong storytelling. And I think those two hand in hand, as more data is obviously being generated and tracked and shared, that I have loved seeing that type of quantitative plus qualitative connection has really been prominent in the last several years. That is, from a side as a marketer, has been really eye-grabbing and appealing. And so that use and that tool to showcase the urgency is thumbs up from my point of view, because it's powerful. And then I guess from the other side of gaps, from where I see, I think some of the skepticism around corporations who are trying hard and succeeding to genuinely move the needle, but with so much greenwashing, it's hard to truly share that message and have it be heard by media outlets. I think it's one that, the last decade, with so much energy into the space of trying to do green and whatnot, it's hard for some of us that are actually genuinely doing it to rise above the noise. And so I think that's something that, as being a practitioner of trying to showcase and tell everyone about the cool stuff that's happening, that's always one that comes to mind. And I think the second one is, it kind of correlates to it, is that with the media business model increasingly being driven by so much ad revenue and the new shifting model of so many mainstream, media outlets, where you need to, as we're talking about, you need to draw people in, you need to, hit them with things that drive traffic. I often find that the good news pieces that come from a lot of climate firms is not something that gets picked up as often, and to the point about being muscled out with so much less time and attention to hear, to listen, to truly get through the greenwashing. And then if you got through it, to be like, yes, I'm going to place this, and I'm actually going to spend time on this. It's like you kind of have to battle two bosses to actually get something shared through different outlets. So those would be kind of my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Greg. Binu, I saw you nodding while Greg was speaking. Where have you seen the biggest successes and biggest gaps in climate news reporting? And has Pembina been having trouble breaking through in the same way that Greg described?
Yeah, I'm exactly I was like, oh, Greg, you actually articulated what I was going to say even better than I could have. One of the best successes I've seen also is this rise of data journalism. And, us as experts are not great at storytelling, and journalists are filling that gap. I actually wanted to share an example where I saw this happen really well and actually had an impact on policy. It's about a decade ago, we had really good media coverage about the health impacts of coal power plants. And this was driven by data that was generated by experts as well as the government of Canada on different types of health impacts. And I think what the journalists did a good job of was they built off that data to actually translate that into understandable metrics around hospitalizations, deaths, cost implications, also like putting dollar figures on it. They also brought in a lot of relevant perspectives. So they had quotes from medical professionals, workers who would be impacted by it, clean energy experts, as well as the industry that was going to be impacted by phasing out coal. And there was also a discussion of actual practical solutions that would replace coal. And what ended up happening then was in 2012, a conservative federal government in Canada passed the first coal phase out legislation in the world. And so I think a lot of the success of that legislation is because of the media coverage that issue got, and it was so thoughtfully done. And I want to build on that too with a more recent example with some of the things we're seeing in long form journalism. So one example I want to use is the Narwhal's coverage of impact of coal phase out on coal workers. So this is a decade later. They're now looking at, okay, we passed all these legislations. What does this mean for coal workers? And like bringing those coal worker voices to the table, talking about the nuances of challenges. You know, we talk about numbers of jobs created, numbers of jobs lost, but they're talking about, well, I own a farm. I can't move to take on a renewable energy job in Tabor. And then they also put a lot of context in and also fact check some of the workers' claims. So some workers, for example, were saying they depend on clean energy, clean coal to bring their jobs back. And, you know, the coverage also questioned the validity of clean coal. So I think there's some really good trends in terms of that type of coverage. When I look at gaps, one of the major gaps I feel is that the stories are still dominated very, very much from a white colonial perspective and from industry voices that are quite established. And I think the challenge for us is how do you represent voices that are not on the first page of your Google search? You know, one example I like to use is how in Canada, we keep talking about how Canada needs to produce more oil and gas to support the global South in their in the efforts they're making to strive for prosperity. But where are the voices of the global South that are echoing the exact same sentiment? So I think we need to bring those perspectives. And I think like if you interviewed the energy minister of Kenya, I'm not sure if he will echo the exact same speaking points. So I think we need to bring those other perspectives in. We need to bring greater coverage of women experts in the energy sector, of BIPOC experts. And I think that'll help fill out the picture better. Stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Binu. Steve, you and your team have been building a massive good news story with your bare hands for nearly a year now. Where have you seen the biggest successes, the biggest gaps in climate news reporting?
Thanks, Mitchell. The Ottawa Climate Action Fund, so folks know, is a program of the Ottawa Community Foundation, which gives us the credibility to actually say carbon down and community up, given the relationships and track record of the foundation. I'm going to take an approach here, Mitchell, a little bit of a report card time. So I'm going to give a passing grade to climate reporting on making it relatable and accessible, connecting climate change with day-to-day concerns of people and businesses. For example, I've seen some uptick in the kind of storyline of electric vehicle owners don't have to pay these high gasoline prices. That's great. And when it comes to climate literacy, I'm going to say a B+. Like overall awareness and concern is much higher than it was even a few years ago. People get that there's a climate emergency, but I'm going to have to only give a passing grade to understanding of local climate impacts. What's at stake? What are the opportunity costs of not rapidly decarbonizing and preparing for impacts? Heat deaths, power outages, supply chain disruption, right? We climate folks are just terrible wonks, mitigation, adaptation, decarbonization. Like, we've got to keep it simple and have the media help echo that, prevent and prepare. I'm going to talk about some more serious gaps, and I think we may need a parent-teacher conference here. It's a bit past report card time. There is still a shocking level of climate illiteracy. People are unable to just follow the carbon. It is wonderful to wash your plastic bags, God bless, but we have to know that buildings and transportation are responsible for the majority of carbon pollution. Make it easier to remember. Buildings, transportation, how we heat our buildings, and in Canada that means getting off of fossil gas and getting heat pumps, and transportation. Electrify our vehicles and drive less. Simple messages to make this understandable. That's got to come through. On the solution side, I'm going to give it A- in terms of a strong focus on the critical and obvious technologies, EVs and PVs, electric vehicles and photovoltaics. But there's some important gaps around the non-sexy technologies, insulation, sealing air leaks, better insulating our windows and walls, and heat pumps. Probably the most important climate technology that too many Canadians are unaware of and don't understand. Try this. It's basically a refrigerator that can run forwards and backwards. Kicks off hot air like the coils behind your fridge and cold air inside. It can cool our buildings in an efficient, low carbon way and heat them as well. Other non-sexy technology, public transit, bikes, walking, e-bikes, and then non-technology solutions are often not in the reporting. Sidewalks and bike lanes, as well as walkable 15-minute neighborhoods. Here's a storyline I'd like to see more of. If your neighborhood was more pedestrian friendly and had more places to shop, work, and play, you'd be saving a lot of money at the gas pump.
I love the way you messaged that without using any of the C words like climate and carbon and crisis, but those were all climate messages. We're going to go back to the journalists, and I am delighted to welcome Megan Darby, the editor of Climate Home News in London, UK. Thank you for being here, Megan. I'm glad you could join us. The question we have, and Megan, you're first up on this. News reporting is supposed to be about gathering the evidence and following wherever it leads. There's also a journalism tradition that is about comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. How do those two principles mix and merge when you're reporting on the climate emergency? Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Mitchell. And I'm so sorry to be joining late, a mix up in the timing on my part. But everything seems to be working, so that's all good. Yeah, follow the evidence versus afflicting the comfortable. I mean, I don't really see a tension between those two things. I think, you know, the evidence generally points to a huge gulf between the climate makers, the polluters, and the climate takers, you know, the people who are really, who emit very little and are suffering the worst impacts. So, and I don't know, having been late, I don't know how much of this has been covered already, but I'm the editor of Climate Home News, so I come to this from an international perspective. I cover the international negotiations and international dimensions of the climate crisis, which includes the sort of ongoing tensions between you know, developing countries and the poorer countries who are just like, you guys caused this problem, can't you fix it? And you know, give us some money while you're at it. And the developed countries like, you know, we'll find some nice technology and it'll all be cool. I simplify. So I think there's, yeah, so to come back to the question, afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, part of our job is amplifying the voices of people who are really the most vulnerable to the impacts and being hit by them now, and joining the dots between that and the sort of high carbon lifestyles that I would guess pretty much everyone in this audience is complicit in. So part of the job is that. And I think also taking on the vested interests and resisting the kind of the other rather hopefully falling out of fashion journalistic tradition of both sidesing things. You know, there are not two equivalent sides on climate change. There's following the evidence, and the evidence pointing towards burning fossil fuels is doing bad things to the climate and to the livability of our homes. So yeah, I think that's probably enough to start with to kick off with. Back to you, Mitchell.
Thanks very much, Megan. And I have to say, you referred to the international coverage that has really been Climate Home News' Stock and Trade, and really, just putting it out there, you're the publication that we rely on, you know, for so many leads to what's going on in that level, and for a lot of really courageous investigative reporting as well. Before we go to you, Alex, just a quick note to participants: we have some comments coming up and some questions coming up in the chat. If you could please use the Q&A box for your questions. That's where we'll be looking for material to bring forward in the Q&A session. Alex, over to you. We're supposed to be about gathering the evidence, following where it leads, and there's a tradition about comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, how to build, mix, and merge in our report. You're muted, Alex. Alex, you're muted.
I had remuted myself without realizing it. I'm sorry.
I keep doing that too.
Just to revert to something Megan said about not adopting the traditional journalist's two sides to every question. Thank you very much for that. I think it's very necessary not to, though it doesn't always get you popular with senior editors, but there you are, needs doing, I think. I think that trying to bring these 2 points together, the gathering the evidence, following wherever it leads, and comforting the afflicted, and so on. There's a phrase which I think helps us to do that. I can remember, I think it was in 2007, the first time the IPCC, in one of its reports, used a phrase which has stuck with me for ever since, and I think needs more and more exposure. The phrase was abrupt and irreversible. And I think that too many of us still think that climate change is something that is neither abrupt nor irreversible. It will be a gentle progression towards a warmer world, which we shall cope with, and it won't be irreversible because we shall just be able to turn the taps off and revert to what we had before. It is abrupt and irreversible. It deals in tipping points, the tipping points with which we are all familiar, the tipping points which could throw the workings of the connected Earth systems completely out of kilter. I'd just like to go through 3 stories that we in the Climate News Network have done in the last 18 months, which I think helped to make the point. In August 2020, we did a story saying that climate science's worst case scenario isn't just an awful warming, it describes what is already happening right now. I think that helps to focus attention in a way that often it has not been focused. By the end of the century, the planet could be between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was at the launch of the Industrial Revolution, when we switched on to fossil fuels in a big way. Later that same month, in August 2020, the amount of Greenland ice, the extent of Greenland ice loss had reached the point where the amount of ice lost to the sea annually by the melting of the Iceland, the amount of warming caused by the melting of Greenland's ice cap was now more than the snow that falls on the island. That was a tipping point. The island's glaciers have dwindled and retreated so much that the annual snowfall can now no longer replace the lost ice. And that's a major tipping point. And then in March 22, this month, we reported that the Amazon could begin a process of inexorable change towards grassland or savanna. Researchers found the Amazon's dry seasons have become longer, droughts more common and severe, and the loss of resilience was more pronounced. Well, if you take those 3 moves towards tipping points, you begin to realize that the urgency of what is happening is something that a lot of people have not grasped. If they do begin to grasp it, then they're going to need to listen to the voices of those most affected. And with urgency, which I think we need to focus on what is happening, we need also to realize, just reverting to something else that you'd mentioned before, you asked us to spotlight the gaps that are slowing down the shift off carbon. I think one of the chief of those breaks on realizing what is happening is wealth. You said, someone said, I forget who it was this afternoon, that you might not get the same answer from the Prime Minister of Kenya as you would from the Prime Minister of Canada or the UK. Wealth is a great divider when it comes to climate change, and we can treat it in sessions like this, or we can treat it by the lived experience of people who are doing. I think we need to get wealth coupled with urgency, and we need to make the case in a way that uses the language that our audience uses, because so often the discussions we have are framed in language which makes sense in the Northern Hemisphere, but not so much, if at all, in the South. A researcher I spoke to last month said he thinks climate change is not a future problem. We have 5 years. If that is so, then we need to be speaking in a quite different way. And that is going to involve afflicting the comfortable with the message that comes from the afflicted. And it's only when we can marry those two up that we shall be getting somewhere. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. We're going to go to the 3 practitioners now. We are hearing so much, and obviously rightly so, on the urgency of the issue and the message, and on the challenge of getting the message out to people in language and in ways that'll land and actually lead to action. So starting with Binu, what are the 1 or 2 most important things that climate news and practitioner organizations can do to reach outside the bubble of audiences that are already paying attention to the climate emergency and build wider buy-in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Mitchell. I think it's something we struggle with a lot. I think connects to some of the questions from the audience also. How do you connect to rural audiences? How do you make the news local? It's something we really struggle with, especially in my field of grid transition, which can be quite wonky. And often what I find is you have to meet people where they're at and find out the issues that they care about. Some of the places we've had success is, when there is a heat wave that affects everybody, when utility bills are high, or there is a massive power outage. So being able to connect to those things really helps. One thing I wanted to share, I'm going to put a link in there for it too, is the Pembina Institute did an Alberta Narratives project where we tried to figure out how do we talk to Albertans, where this is especially a divisive issue about climate change and energy transition. And some of the lessons we learned there is we need to speak to people's values, their identity, and what they care about. So in Alberta, for example, we found out that people are really proud of the province's clean air and water. So being able to connect to that was really helpful. They have a really strong identity of being resourceful and hard workers that build things. So again, like being able to connect our stories to those things are helpful. And the other thing I would say is also being able to connect to big news. I think I tried to answer this question live as well. So things like the Russian invasion, the question you started with, Mitchell, there's, I think, an energy transition and a climate lens to almost every major geopolitical event that's happening. And it's going to be increasingly true in the future. So finding those angles, and for example, what's happening with Russia is it's accelerating the European Union's transition away from depending on Russian fossil gas. And so, for example, Germany has advanced its commitment to clean grid from 2050 to 2035. So it's following those stories that are also pieces of the larger geopolitical news. I think that could be helpful.
Thanks very much, Binu. Steve, same question to you. What are the 1 or 2 most important things that climate news and practitioners can do to reach outside the bubble, which I know OCAF is about every single day?
I think The first is highlighting opportunities for people to get involved beyond consumerism, beyond waiting for government or industry to come up with solutions, and getting beyond finger pointing. It's only if industry, it's only if government, if only if consumers. It's realizing that if we don't partner to co-create solutions, we're just not going to get there. That could be at the scale of neighborhood planning or engaging city council or broader public-private community collaboration. So that's the first part of it. It's not just about buying stuff. The second is really about making sure that there's deep engagement of equity-seeking groups, whether they're working to advance housing security, food security, diversity, inclusion, indigenous rights, anti-racism, welcoming new immigrants. It's about making sure those voices are well represented to co-create and benefit from climate solutions. Over the past year, Mitchell, as you know, OCAF has been co-facilitating a climate equity initiative in Ottawa with Ecology Ottawa, bringing together folks, 6 climate change groups and 7 social inclusion groups who didn't really know each other, just to get to know each other, understand who are you, what do you care about, what do you do? And 3 issues came to the fore: local green jobs, affordable housing and walkable neighborhoods, and food waste reduction. And those are so rich and those are so important for the full solutions that we're going to need.
Thank you, Steve. Greg, how do we get outside the bubble, both as practitioners and as climate journalists?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of kind of like ways of being creative, I think, is necessary to get outside the bubble. I think like you need to get outside the bubble to spaces and people who aren't caring about it. So how do you make people care? And I think like that goes down to like using the human stories to tell them like, hey, if you don't care, there's things that are going to happen, and really humanizing those for those people to make them care, I think is one way that has been effective in the last while of showcasing all the human stories that we now have, unfortunately, of the impact of the climate crisis, to truly try to get through those other pockets in unique, creative ways, which is not easy. It's easy to just continue to say the same stories. It's harder to really find ways to connect with people who you're not usually connecting with. So that's one that I always find intriguing. And I think another one is the what's in it for me. I think as a marketer, like that's always a classic, go-to when you're trying to like reach and capture someone's attention. But like the what's in it for me, I think now there's so many ways where that can go with energy efficiency, work. What's in it for me is that there's now a good business case to go with heat pumps and other ways to actually, benefit selfishly, which also are really good for the planet. And so climate news to truly like bring light to ways that consumers can please their selfish, desire for X or Y, but also hiddenly, continue to move the agenda forward on climate news. And so what's in it for me is always one that I like to go back to, because altruistically, if my water is not going to be available 10 years from now because of the situation, well, I want to know about that, and maybe I can do something about that because I want water, right? So those are just some initial thoughts.
Maybe a question to any panelists who want to take this up, maybe just in a quick lightning round. If on one hand, given that on one hand, we have this huge, massive structural emergency that, as you pointed out, affects everything. And we have audiences who, as you're pointing out as well, are interested in the immediate, the day-to-day. Has anybody seen, heard, achieved any pathways to bringing those together, so that we start with people where they're at, but gradually bring the conversation around to, in improv comedy, we like to call it a yes and. That, yeah, it's absolutely about what we can do in our own lives. And yeah, it's also about making sure the subsidies are gone and making sure the emission caps go on. And speaking of going on, I could go on about that, but how do we make those connections? Anybody, just jump in.
Mitchell, I'll jump in. I think it's important that we help people.
You just muted yourself, Steve.
Help people understand. My goodness. Okay. Help people understand issues that people don't think of as climate related, to understand that they are very much climate related. So like the land use housing affordability, transportation connection. I'll send around an op-ed around that as one example. But everyone cares about housing affordability. Everyone cares about gasoline prices, and understanding how urban form connects all of those is quite important.
Any other examples, Anna? I think.
I just want to double down on that, which is meet people where they are on the issues that concern them, and then remind them that this is also a climate thing. Just everywhere you can, make the climate connection in stories.
Okay, thank you, Megan.
Yeah, I would also say that journalism is about storytelling, and if you can tell a story that surprises people, then you can get to get some stealth education on the climate crisis. And that we had an investigation a couple of months ago which just started with this mad nugget that we saw, where a carbon credit, a carbon offset, had been sold for $20,000, $80,000. It was an astonishingly large sum, and we were like, what on earth is going on? And it was a cryptocurrency venture. So already it's like, whoa, okay, some tech bros are getting involved, what's going on here? And so our reporter Chloe got into this this community on Discord, on this chat platform, with all these crypto investors who are really hyped about this carbon offsetting cryptocurrency initiative. It was basically a scam, but what was really fascinating was that she got to interview the person behind this, and to the technicalities of it were quite complicated. Cryptocurrency, carbon markets, these are like highly technical, jargon-filled things, but behind it there were humans, and there were humans who were like really hyped up and excited. So she was able to show that there was this this community where they were like generating this hype, and that was something that's quite easy for readers to understand, and that there was this character behind it who was just this guy who owned a business in Bradford, UK, who had suddenly decided that he was going to like save the planet and plant a load of trees in Pakistan, yeah, he made a lot of claims that were unsubstantiated, and she was able to fact check those and drop a WhatsApp to the climate minister of Pakistan and say, have you heard of these guys? And he was like, no. So I think what we were able to do there was to tell a story that was about people doing something surprising, and within that there was a bit of stealthy educating the reader about carbon markets and all the madness that that flows from them. So I think like fundamentally it's about storytelling, and readers are fairly sharp about seeing when when you're like trying to push an agenda. They've seen it, they've seen the lines before. So I think when you can really tell a human story, that's when it gets interesting, and you get somewhere with perhaps different audiences to the ones you usually reach.
Okay, thanks, Megan. And Greg, same question, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Yeah, I think another example I love is the World Wildlife Fund. The fact that people care about animals, and initially, they were all about how to preserve animals and whatnot, and then they quickly integrated the climate lens to that, because now it is so forefront to the situation. I think they connect with people because people connect with cute animals, and I think they've been very successful over the several decades in doing that. I think another example is that as at CoPower, we created a green bond, and I think one thing that is interesting is there's not a lot of investment opportunities for individuals where you can get them on a good investment, but intrigue them on a good investment, and then through the backwards, like actually tell them where this goes and how this actually impacts the system or climate and whatnot. I think now we're at a world where there's these types of products in investable industries where it's good for your bottom line and people get intrigued, but then you can truly continue to push and share messages as to the impact of that type of work. So it allows them to come into a space where they not normally would come into.
Thank you. The other examples that came to mind, just as you were saying that, we've heard of a few organizations that are starting out with community groups focused on just waste and excessive waste. And both things are true, that for climate practitioners, yes, waste is part of the picture, but as Steve pointed out, it's buildings, it's transportation. But if people are starting from waste, we've heard stories of how within those groups, the conversations gradually shifted so that, oh, okay, so the waste is plastic, right? Plastic's a petroleum product, okay. That means we need to focus on that supply chain. And that conversation, as I've understood, took place in Alberta, which if you're outside Canada is part of the fossil producing center of our country. So those conversations again started where people are at rather than move towards the bigger picture aspect of the issue. So we've got a lot of questions coming in, like probably every webinar everywhere. We wanted to catch them all and we won't because there just won't be enough time. But this question, I think, folks, comes back to something that a couple of you addressed toward the beginning of the webinar. If the struggle is to include climate issues in the daily news, does it not run the risk of becoming noise? And the comment is during the Second World, further question, during the Second World War, was there ever a day in which the war did not appear above the fold? Is tyranny of the immediate a manifestation of our interrupt-driven social media and other phenomena? And how can journalism skew more to the important and urgent and not just the immediate? So any of the three journalists, please jump in.
I can speak to the social media part quickly, which is I think tyranny of the immediate is just a function of human bandwidth, and that there is a lot of news in the world and not much time in our days, and that at the end of the day, the people making choices about what goes on the homepage or what goes in the top slot on broadcasts are people who have experiences and make editorial decisions. And social media, of course, doesn't help with our individual attention spans or our ability to really digest big news events, but there always have been, as long as there's been journalism, big news stories that are going to dominate the front page, the broadcast, and our attention. And I think that's just a function of being human. Finding a way to integrate it, to allow readers to see multiple stories at one time and hold multiple realities is also important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and obviously the dominant story for the past few weeks has been the conflict in Ukraine. Or I say obviously, it has been in Europe. Actually, you're in a different media environment, but Mitchell is nodding. Yeah, and there are climate angles in that, just like anything else. And possibly you already covered this at the start. I don't want to repeat what's gone before, but what you are seeing is there's a lot of interest in it from all different angles. And in Europe, it's really driven a conversation about how do we reduce reliance on Russian fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas being the particularly hard habit to break, because particularly Germany is very dependent on Russian gas. And the conversation, you are seeing this tension between the oil companies being like, haha, you need us now. You thought you could do without us, but you can't. And they're sort of cackling with glee and enjoying their windfall profits. But also you are seeing it re-energize energy efficiency, and insulating houses is always seen as like the sort of unsexy but worthy climate solution. And now it's like, you know, this is actually about freedom and peace. It's got this renewed urgency and impetus behind it. So that's a climate angle on the conflict. You know, insulate your house to Putin-proof it. So there's kind of a tension between these, and it will take a few months, years to really judge who won out. I think yeah, there's definitely some oil companies sort of making hay out of the situation, but there's also an opportunity to accelerate the clean energy transition. But yeah, there are climate angles. Again, going back to people, I mean, we interviewed, and I think we weren't the only ones, but we interviewed the lead scientist, climate scientist in Ukraine, who had to leave the IPCC meeting early because her home was coming under Russian fire. So there are human stories, you know, everything, there's a climate connection to everything. so it doesn't have to be a choice between covering the war and covering climate. This is a fossil fueled war. And the the response to it is going to determine. I'm glad you like Putin proof. I sort of workshopped that on Twitter. I was just looking at somebody in the chat commenting on Putin proof. Yeah, I lost my thread now. I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Okay, actually, that media narrative that you were talking about, Megan, and that messaging battle, actually, between fossil companies saying, "Okay, you need us now. Do you appreciate us yet?" versus the real solutions that are really coming to the fore in Europe. To the practitioners, just because we've ended up with a panel of 3 journalists from the UK and the United States and 3 practitioners from Canada. That was accidental but fortuitous once we noticed that. So to be new, Steve and Greg, how are you seeing that same conversation playing out here? Certainly we're seeing massive coverage and what feels here like massive spin, about amping up Canadian fossil fuel production on the assumption that anything produced and developed here could in any way be relevant going to a crisis going on right now in real time, apart from all the other climate issues involved. But how do you see that conversation back and forth playing out in Canada? Just briefly. And while you're pondering that unscheduled question, I'll just let the audience know and acknowledge that none of the panelists expected that question today. So if we have no answers, that's on your moderator, not on the panelists.
No, I mean, I'll attempt a little bit of what's happening here from my Alberta vantage point. I think it's exactly what you're saying, Mitchell. Like, it's interesting to see the dominant narrative being, oh, this means there is a role for Canadian ethical oil better in the international market. But it brings up a few issues. So one thing I want to say is there is a bit of a backlash actually on seeing this message as being exploitative. Where the first priority should be on lives lost and the huge destruction that's happening for people in Ukraine, and this being, seeing as being too opportunistic. So there is a bit of backlash to it, which restores your faith in humanity a bit. But I think the other thing this also brings up is some of the stuff we were talking about around the challenges of covering energy issues. There is so much misinformation in this. Canadian oil is not really ethical. We are not the best in terms of GHG intensity. And so there's all these myths that are being perpetuated and not fully being challenged in the media space. I think that'd be my initial observations on what's happening right now.
Thank you. Steve or Greg, briefly on the same question if you want.
I think some of it underscores the tyranny of the immediate, that we get caught flat-footed. If we've been doing all the things we've known we need to do for the past 30 years, there'd be more electric vehicles, there'd be sort of more walkable communities. And so I think in some ways it's on us, because we're so often we'll show the pretty before and after picture of what the green future could look like, instead of spending enough time on what is that pathway, bumps, warts, and all to get there. And I think in terms of the overall sort of zeitgeist on this and all issues, we need safe spaces for mature and respectful discussion. Like, this is challenging. There's stuff we've got to figure out together. And if we don't figure out together, we know where it's going. And so, maybe a hope or a prayer that we can sort of realize that we need to plan ahead. These aren't all immediate solutions. And there are things that can happen in the short term, but I think it can lead to some despair. Like, well, I don't have that AV, or I can't do that now. So,
Nothing to add. Mitch, you can go to the next question.
Greg. One more time, sorry.
Nothing to add to this one. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are coming quickly to the half hour and to the end of the webinar. I'd like to go to each panelist for just a quick lightning round, half a minute of last observations, last reactions. Alex, would you like to go first?
Did you say me?
Please.
Right. I just want to finish with one thing that was said not so long ago by a man who used to be British diplomat. Then he gave that up. He became an academic and an expert on climate change. His name was Chris Pinter-Kell. I was talking to him once. He said to me this, which has stuck with me. When it comes to protecting the environment, the hardest thing we have to do is to find new ways of thinking. And we all like the old ways of thinking. And if we're going to stick with them, I don't give us very long. If we don't find new ways of thinking, I think there is some hope for us.
Thank you. Anna.
I think hope is an essential ingredient in this work. As a journalist, partly, I try to hold on to hope. There's that adage in journalism that if it bleeds, it leads, but I don't think that that has to be true, and it certainly shouldn't punish or dictate the kind of climate coverage that we do. We saw recently, there's been a lot of talk recently in the last few months that scary coverage tends to turn people off, tends to turn off readers, paralyze them, make them think that there's nothing that they can do. And so why even try? And so hope is absolutely an essential ingredient for everyone working in this space to maintain, and then also to try to encourage other people to have, because if we don't have it, we're not going to be able to address this as we need to. So.
Okay, thank you. Megan.
Yeah, I guess I'd say hope comes with action, and we should think of journalism as empowering readers to act, readers or your audience, whatever medium you might be operating through. And every person can influence the course of things. We are past, I think climate used to be considered as something that the experts would fix without ordinary people having to do much. And I think if that was ever true, it's not true now. Everybody has a role to play in tackling the climate crisis and informing people, giving people the tools to play that role and to be thoughtful about it is one of the most important things that journalism can do.
Thank you, Megan. Greg, last thought.
Yeah, I echo what Anna was saying about the parallelization when you see all the news. So I think my last thought is every individual, it's gonna take all of us to solve this. And I think taking individuals through that journey and laddering them up to taking action, be it LED light bulbs, what was that, like 15 years ago, to like continually increasing their involvement and empowerment through this, so that then a big, scary report that gets reported properly doesn't just like sink everybody into a place of like, I can't do anything. This is just bigger than me, which I still feel living in this world. So take them along a journey so we all can be along with it as well.
Okay, thank you. Binu.
Yeah, I think one thing that's coming clear from this panel is that the energy transition requires coverage that is nuanced, that's representative of multiple voices, while still being able to captivate people's attention. And we're running out of time. Decisions that are being made today could potentially lock us into assets that are seriously going to jeopardize our ability to avoid catastrophic climate change. So I think we do need to take some collective action now. That is a step change from the coverage we're seeing right now. And the hope I see is in some of the promising trends on long-form journalism, data journalism that's happening. Even from the wonky think tank side, I think we're making better efforts at communicating. And I'd love to see more collaboration happening or between clean energy transition experts and journalists. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. So I'm going to pop my email actually in the chat here if people want to continue this conversation and look for opportunities. But thanks, Mitchell.
Thank you, Binu. I'm so glad you're doing that, and I'll encourage others to as well if you're so inclined. And Steve, last thoughts.
I'm struck that we can't afford to do one thing at a time. I remember when the environment versus economy was a big thing. Like, we've grown so much since then. Journalism has helped, analysis has helped, and we need to bring equity into that. Housing and transportation affordability, something that people care about, are going to help on climate, both in terms of progress and getting people involved. So it's a little bit about thinking bigger and not just trying to focus linearly on one thing at a time.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all the panelists. We are at the half hour almost exactly, so this does bring us to the end of our program. I'd like to profusely, gratefully thank the panelists: Anna Hyatt of Covering Climate Now, Megan Darby of Climate Home News, Alex Kirby of Climate News Network and the Energy Mix, Greg Overmont of Van City Community Investment Bank, Binu Jayakumar of Deepen Institute, and Steve Winkleman of the Ottawa Climate Action Fund for an hour that felt like it went by in about 5 minutes. And yes, I prepared those words in advance, but I was pretty confident. My colleagues Mélile Vincent and Eric Lukaszewski for managing the Q&A and the webinar platform, Chris Benazia for live tweeting, and Clifford Mains for the session coverage that you'll find in tomorrow's Energy Mix Digest. And most of all, thanks to all of you for being here and sharing your knowledge, your questions, and your interest in climate journalism. I've always loved hearing the line on the US public broadcasting system when they talk about how they depend on viewers like you, because I know that it's true. You're the only reason we do what we do. You're the only way we can do what we do, whether it's covering the news or organizing webinars like this one. Please don't forget to fill out our 90-second survey. It really is just 90 seconds, we think. You'll find the link in the chat, and we'll be sending it out again by email. Please visit and bookmark theenergymix.com for the latest news, the latest climate news you need, and subscribe to get the latest on climate, energy, and the shift off carbon. And please also visit and follow the groups that you've met through this webinar: Covering Climate Now, Climate Home News, Van City Community Investment Bank, the Deepen Institute, and the Ottawa Climate Action Fund. I feel like I've just read you a list of some of the all-star organizations that are going to get us through to the end of the climate emergency relatively safe and relatively sound. So thank you once again for being here, and have a good rest of the day.